Peter's miraculous escape from prison. It was about this time that King Herod arrested some who belonged to the church, intending to persecute them. He had James, the brother of John, put to death with the sword. When he saw that this pleased the Jews, he proceeded to seize Peter also. This happened during the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. After arresting him, he put him in prison, handing him over to be guarded by 4 squads of 4 soldiers each. Herod intended to bring him out for public trial after the Passover. So Peter was kept in prison, but the church was earnestly praying to God for him. The night before Herod was to bring him to trial, Peter was sleeping between 2 soldiers, bound with 2 chains, and the sentry stood guard at the entrance. Suddenly an angel of the Lord appeared, and a light shone in the cell. He struck Peter on the side and woke him up. "Quick, get up," he said, and the chains fell off Peter's wrists. Then the angel said to him, "Put on your clothes and sandals," and Peter did so. "Wrap your cloak around you and follow me," the angel told him. Peter followed him out of the prison, but he had no idea that what the angel was doing was really happening. He thought he was seeing a vision. They passed the first and second guards and came to the iron gate leading to the city. It opened for them by itself, and they went through it. When they had walked the length of one street, suddenly the angel left him. Then Peter came to himself and said, "Now I know without a doubt that the Lord sent his angel and rescued me from Herod's clutches and from everything the Jewish people were anticipating." When this had dawned on him, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, also called Mark, where many people had gathered and were praying. Peter knocked at the outer entrance, and a servant girl named Rhoda came to answer the door. When she recognized Peter's voice, she was so overjoyed she ran back without opening it and exclaimed, "Peter is at the door." "You're out of your mind," they told her. When she kept insisting that it was so, they said, "It must be his angel." But Peter kept on knocking, and when they opened the door and saw him, they were astonished. Peter motioned with his hand for them to be quiet and described how the Lord had brought him out of the prison. "Tell James and the brothers about this," he said, and then he left for another place. In the morning there was no small commotion among the soldiers as to what had become of Peter. After Herod had a thorough search made for him and did not find him, he cross-examined the guards and ordered that they be executed. Then Herod went from Judea to Caesarea and stayed there for a while. He had been quarrelling with the people of Tyre and Sidon, and they now joined together and sought an audience with him. Having secured the support of Blastus, a trusted personal servant of the king, they asked for peace because they depended on the king's country for their food supply. On the appointed day, Herod, wearing his royal robes, sat on his throne and delivered a public address to the people. They shouted, "This is the voice of a God, not of a man." Immediately, because Herod did not give praise to God, an angel of the Lord struck him down, and he was eaten by worms and died. But the word of God continued to increase and spread. When Barnabas and Saul had finished their mission, they returned from Jerusalem, taking with them John, also called Mark.
Well, just the other week, I was going through my mail when I noticed that I had a letter that had obviously been put in my letterbox by mistake. It was the right number, same number as my house, but it was actually for the street around the corner from me. And it's not the first time something like that has happened. I'm sure most people have had the wrong mail put in their box at some stage. It's a simple mistake, and it just happens from time to time. But it reminded me of an event that happened many years ago. I was heading out to Bible study one night, and I was walking out the door, and my dad handed me an envelope. And he said that it'd been put in our letterbox, but it's not ours. Can you drop it in this person's box on your way to your study group? And I said, sure. And I looked at the address, and it happened to be the same street that I was actually going to for the study that night, which made it very easy. But then when I actually saw the name, I then realized that it was the same unit number that I was going to. It was the unit of the actual Bible study that I was going to be at that night. Now, when you think of it, what are the chances of that happening? You know, of all the unit blocks, and remembering I just came from Sydney, there are a lot of unit blocks down there. The chances of wrong mail being put in our letterbox, that's not that unusual, but that mail being addressed to the unit that I was going to for Bible study in a different street altogether from where I lived, wasn't in the same road. Well, I have absolutely no idea how to work out the odds for that. You know, it's got to be millions to one. You know, it's just such a random thing. But random is all it really is. You know, it's just a really, really weird coincidence. I don't think there was anything deeper going on there. I doubt it had any real impact on the course of the universe. So there's no lesson to be learnt in all this. There's just something that was really unlikely to happen, right? Just really, really weird chance of that all happening. But whilst that is just one of those random things, there are certainly other times in our life where things are obviously not a coincidence. You know, things that do happen from time to time because it's in God's hands that is happening. It is God's hand at work. So things are happening for a particular reason in order to shape events so as to achieve a specific outcome that God has planned. And sometimes when these happen, we don't even notice, right? Sometimes it's just not possible for us to know why certain things happen. Or sometimes when we finally realize it, you know, it may take years for it to become clear. And only after being able to look back in hindsight do we go, oh, now I get why this was all happening for this purpose. But events do happen from time to time, and happen actually all the time, because God wants them to happen. God is actually in control of everything in this world, and he allows things to happen the way that he wants them to happen so as to work towards what is his ultimate goal. But do you actually believe that? Right? Do you believe that there is a plan that God has laid out and that the events of this world and in your life are happening in a certain way, you know, good or bad from our point of view, so as to achieve this goal of God's? Because the atheist would say that there is no plan. That everything that happens, no matter how amazing, has about as much purpose as just wrong mail in the letterbox. That is just a random thing. It's all random chance. And no matter how coincidental something might be, it is just simply that. A coincidence, random, because there is no one in control. It just happens because, well, it happened to happen. But whatever the atheists may believe in our world today, the Bible does say something very different. It says that the events in this world and the events in our lives, they're actually a result of God's will and the fulfillment of his plan for creation, and that both God's justice and protective hand are at work in this world right now. That nothing is by chance, no matter how random it might seem, but it is all a part of a larger plan by God. So as we're going through this passage this morning, think of the ways in which we see God at work here in this passage. Now, everything that happens here is a consequence of his providence, right? His divine intervention in all aspects of this world. And also, what that should mean for us, right? When it comes to dealing with the troubles of this world and how we should be putting our trust in him even during the hardest times. Right, that's the things to be thinking about this morning as we look at this passage now. But before we go any further, before we dig any deeper, how about I just pray for us as we think about this topic? Our Father, as we look at your word now, and as we think about the ways that you direct all things and how you have a plan for this world and for our lives, we pray that this passage will be an encouragement for all of us, so that each of us will be putting our trust in you, and that we'll be handing our troubles over to you in prayer, knowing that all of creation is under your control. Amen. Now, with this passage, to understand what is going on here, we need to get a bit of context of what is happening with all these people and places and stuff that's going on, because there are a few names here that are mentioned that would sound familiar, but they're not necessarily who you might think that they are. And that's because there are a lot of people in the Bible who have the same name as someone else, and it does get a bit confusing after a while. And even worse, you also have people who sometimes have multiple names, as we see at the end of our passage with John, Mark, and then half of those names are the name of someone else in the Bible, and you sometimes wonder who's this speaking about at any given passage. So it's important to just stop and think about who is who as we go through this passage, because it does actually help bring a lot of what is going on here together. It helps make it all make sense. So we see here that there are three main people in this passage, and one of them is named Peter. And this is the same Peter that we looked at just last week, and we've looked at multiple times during this sermon series. So there's not much to say about him, as we all know who he is. It's the Apostle Peter, right? It's that one. It's that Peter. He's the easy one to know because there's really no confusion going on about his name here. But we also see this passage speaks about a man named James, the brother of John. And that's where things get a little bit more confusing, because there are actually a lot of Jameses in this Bible. Even in this passage, there's a couple mentioned. Firstly, there is James, the brother of Jesus, who wrote the book of James that we have in the Bible. So that's one James, but that's not the James being talked about here, right? It's not the one who wrote the epistle. So that then leaves James the apostle. The only problem is that there are actually two of them. Okay, there are two disciples called James. There is James, the son of Alphaeus, who is often referred to as James the younger or the lesser, because it separates him from the other apostle, who is James the greater, or as one who is known as the son of Zebedee. And that will be important in a moment, okay? Remember that, the son of Zebedee, because that is the James that we're talking about, right? That's the one in this passage, and we'll get back to him soon. But before then, the last person to talk about here is a king named Herod. And it may seem, therefore, that King Herod is back from the dead, because here again, we have another king in Judea killing people. But this is not the King Herod who killed all those boys in Bethlehem trying to get rid of Jesus as a baby. It's not that one. That one's been dead for nearly half a century by the time we get to this point. And so this is the grandson. So it's still the same family. It's still a Herod, but it's not the same man. But what matters here is that, again, a king called Herod sits on the throne over the Jews, and this one is just as deadly as the ones before him, because the reason he sits as king is due to the fact that he has actually made some very powerful friends in the empire, and those friends happen to be the emperors of Rome. Now, we know from history not all the emperors liked him. Tiberius certainly didn't. Tiberius is the emperor mentioned at the start of the book of Acts, and we know that he didn't like him because Tiberius stripped him of all his wealth and threw him in jail. So he certainly had some enemies in the empire, right? There wasn't one emperor who really didn't like this guy. But by the time we get to this point, this chapter, Tiberius is actually now dead. And Caesar Caligula has released Herod from jail and then given his friend power over some of the areas of ancient Israel. And then sometime after this, there's then yet another new emperor, Caesar Claudius, who happens to be a former classmate of this Herod, hence their friendship. And because of that friendship, he's given Herod even more power, putting him in control over all of Judea and Samaria. And that relationship is why he now has that title, king. He now rules this area under his friend back in Rome. And all that information gives us some important context here. Because as I mentioned a moment ago, Acts started under Caesar Tiberius. But he's now dead. And not only has Caligula ruled for a bit, we're now under yet again a different emperor. At the time of this passage, Claudius is in power, and he's actually going to be the third of 4 emperors to rule during the time frame that Acts is set in. So that means that a lot of time has now passed since we started the book of Acts. Right? When we read through Acts, it can be easy to lose track of these years passing because it doesn't always say 1 year later or 5 years later, but there actually can be big jumps of time from one section to the next, even within the one chapter. So as we look at this passage here, we are now actually a number of years after Jesus' death and resurrection. Right? There's an acceleration of time going on here as we work through this book, because we've gone from having each sermon and Bible study in our series, looking at what is the next day or the next week, maybe just a month or two passing between each passage as we move through, to now actually jump in several years, passage by passage. Because at the end of this chapter, it's probably more than a decade after Paul's conversion that we looked at just a couple of weeks ago, and several years after last week's sermon. Because we know that this Herod, the one that's mentioned here, we know that this one died in March 44 AD. Right? That's recorded history outside of the Bible. That's Roman history there. So we started this series with the church being born, but the church would probably be about 15 years old by the time we finish this chapter. So a lot of time has passed just in the last chapter or two, and we know that because we know the dates of when some of these rulers were in power. Now, whilst all that information may seem a bit of trivia and a bit irrelevant at first, knowing it, right, there's a reason why we're looking at it, knowing it actually makes a lot of what we see here make sense. Because before this rule, before this particular Herod died in 44 AD, he's going to set off another round of persecutions against the Christians. Because just like his grandfather, he knows the Jewish beliefs, but unlike his grandfather, this one seems to have a good relationship with the Pharisees. These 15 years of dealing with Christians and the church, as well as the decades since their poster boy, Paul, switched teams, this seems to have changed the workings of the Pharisees somewhat. Because now they seem to be supporting a Herod of all people. And this is because this Herod wants to preserve Judaism and keep the Jews happy. Right? He's willing to do whatever it takes to keep peace in the kingdom. So attacking Christians means keeping his friend in Rome happy, and it also means keeping the Jewish leaders happy. They like it when he persecutes their enemies. So everything happening here in regards to the decisions of this ruler is about trying to keep power for himself and to eliminate any threat to that, and that gives him the support of the people. And what we read in the first few verses shows us that happening, what this persecution is all about. It explains it clearly what his motives are and how this all works. So starting in verse 1, we read this. It was about this time that King Herod arrested some that belonged to the church, intending to persecute them. He had James, the brother of John, put to death with the sword. When he saw that this met with approval among the Jews, he proceeded to seize Peter also. This happened during the festival of unleavened bread. And just there, we have actually now seen something very significant, right? This is a big moment in the book of Acts. Because like Stephen that we looked at a few weeks ago, we see here another martyr is being made, right? Another follower of Jesus being killed. And this is only the second one that we actually have recorded in the book of Acts. We know that more Christians were killed because Paul's own confession tells us that there were multiple Christians killed in his persecution of the church. But this is only one of 2 mentioned by name. Only 2 actually recorded specifically. And as said before, this one is the apostle James, the son of Zebedee. So in this passage, we are seeing the first death of an apostle. Most of the other apostles will get killed. We know that from church history. But this is the first and the only one recorded in Acts. So this Herod has come directly for the apostles themselves. He's wiping out the leadership of the church, which is making the Pharisees very happy, because here we are 15 years since the birth of the church, and the church is now a real threat to everyone and everything. But you might remember I said before that this is James, the son of Zebedee, and that this point is important, but it's important that we know exactly what James is being killed here. And the reason is because it's something that Jesus said years before this all happened. If you recall, there's an incident in the Gospel of Matthew. It happens in chapter 20 of that book, where it says that the mother of Zebedee's sons, which is obviously referring to James here, that the mother comes to Jesus asking for her children to sit at his side. And Jesus responded by saying to her, "You don't know what you are asking." And then after saying that to her, he turns to the brothers and asks them, "Can you drink the cup that I'm going to drink?" And both children said, "We can." In which Jesus then replied, "You will indeed drink from my cup." And that's being fulfilled right here. Just as Jesus has been put to death, now John is drinking from the same cup. He's being killed. Sorry, James is drinking from the same cup. He's being killed as well. So what we're seeing is a fulfillment of prophecy here. Jesus knew exactly how James would die 15 years before it happened. Because ultimately, God has everything under control. There is a plan going on here, including this new wave of persecution by Herod. So James's death is not a mistake, but something that God knew would happen and that he would allow to happen because he's controlling all things for his purposes. And that all becomes even clearer when we see the next victim in all this, which is the Apostle Peter. Because once James has drank his cup, Herod saw that this made the Jews happy, so he now wants to take Peter down as well. And we see that he has him arrested. But surprisingly, he doesn't kill him right away. We see he actually delays the execution. We see that he has Peter thrown in jail and has him extremely well guarded in his cell. Herod was no doubt aware of how whenever the temple guards tried to put Peter in jail before, they often found him just walking around free the next day. So we see here that Herod takes no chances. It says here in verse 4 that Peter is guarded by 4 squads of 4 soldiers each. And then it goes on in verse 6 to say Peter was sleeping between 2 soldiers, bound with 2 chains, and sentries stood guard at the entrance. So he's clearly terrified of Peter doing another disappearing act, which again raises that question of why not just kill him? Why give him the chance to escape? It's almost like a bad James Bond villain, always capturing 007 and then just waiting for him to get free. Why not just kill him on the spot if he has all the control? And it's actually something that the people want. He's not going to have a riot on his hands. The people actually want this to happen. Well, the problem is, verse 3 tells us that Peter was arrested during the festival of unleavened bread. And this festival is also known as the Passover. And you can't kill people on the Passover. If you remember, the Jews rushed to have Jesus killed before the Passover for that very reason, which is itself just an interesting point here, but all this is happening yet again on another Passover, because it means that, Peter nearly died on the same weekend as Jesus, just a decade and a half later. Both these events are happening on this same Passover weekend. Hence why we read that Herod intended to bring him out for public trial after the Passover. So he does want him to die, right? The trial is obviously fixed. He's going to get him killed. He wants him to die because he knows that this will win his approval by the Jews, hence making it a public trial, not a secret one. He wants everyone to see justice happening. But because he's trying to please them, the Jews, he has to keep Peter in jail until it is legally okay by Jewish law for him to have Peter killed. So this is all a political game. A political game by a very dangerous man trying to build up his own power base. He now figures that killing Christians will get him public support, and that will only help to maintain his friendships in Rome. But whatever plans Herod might have had here, whatever Herod's plan may have been, this is where we see that plan clash with God's plan for what he wants to happen. Because just like how an angel let Peter out of jail back in Acts 5, when the temple guards put him in there for preaching, well, we see here in chapter 12, pretty much the same thing happens again. This time it's under higher security, and it's the king himself who has had him put in there. But we see that nothing that they do can stop God from having him freed. So we first see in verse 7 that the angel wakes him up and his chains just fall off. And then in verse 10, we see something more miraculous happen, because it says here, they pass the first and second guards. So these would have been the ones standing guard outside the cell. So Peter must have just miraculously walked past them without them seeing anything, because it's unlikely that the guards would have been asleep, or that Peter could have somehow snuck past them if they were awake, and if he didn't have divine intervention. So just getting past the guards is a miracle in itself. But then it goes on to say that they came to an iron gate leading to the city, and it opened for them by itself, and they went through it. So this iron gate, which is obviously there to control the movement of people, hence why it's made out of iron, it simply opens by itself, so Peter can just walk straight back into the city without any hindrance. And this is because Peter still has a part to play in God's bigger plan for the church. Peter was to take the gospel out to everyone, even the Gentiles, as we saw last week with the Roman centurion. And this political game of Herod's is in the way of all that. And because Peter's job is not done yet, God makes this happen, so he can continue to be a part of growing the kingdom. So like what we see with the Egyptian pharaohs and the kings of Babylon, and even with this king's grandfather, we're actually seeing the same thing happen here as well. These people, these rulers, have a plan. And God has a plan, and only one ever wins out. Hence why we see Peter saying, verse 11, "Now I know without a doubt that the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from Herod's clutches and from everything the Jewish people were hoping would happen." All right, Peter now gets this fact. He understands that this and everything else, it's always under God's control, and God's plans are always fulfilled. So even when it seems like the enemy is winning, it is only as much as God will allow to happen for his purposes. We know from that quote of Jesus earlier, James was going to be made a martyr, and that would be the end of his ministry. He'd done his job in the building of the church, so he was now not rescued from King Herod's attack. And despite saving Peter here, God will also allow him to be martyred about 20 years after this. He won't save Peter that time. So Peter will be killed for his faith eventually, but even in that, that was a part of God's plan for the kingdom, because Jesus also said that would happen. We know from the Gospel of John, Peter said this to Peter. Jesus said this to Peter in chapter 21. "When you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." And then John comments on that, right? He leaves a little commentary on it. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And what we know from history is that just like Jesus, Peter was crucified. It's where they end up building the Vatican in Rome, on the site where he was martyred. Which is all a big lesson for us right now. What we need to know is that in this world, bad things happen, and we don't always know why. We can't always understand these things, but what we can know for a fact is God has a reason. Because nothing happens in this world that catches God out. We saw a few weeks ago how Stephen's death served a purpose. His death caused the church to spread out and grow massively overnight. We certainly know that Jesus' death served a purpose, and that was part of a plan, even if at the time, everyone, including Peter, probably thought that God had abandoned them and didn't have control over the situation. We know that Jesus' death was no mistake, but was something planned from the very start of creation. And as Peter learns here, both his faith and the fate of James, that's all part of God's plan as well. What we need to know and trust in is that everything that happens in this world is to fulfill God's purposes according to his plan to restore all things. But whilst all this is going on, Peter being arrested and held in jail and ready to face this sham trial, whilst all this is going on, we see in verse 5 that the Christians from the town, they're all together and they're praying for this situation, right? They're praying for God's involvement. It says the church was earnestly praying to God for him. So when this persecution by the authorities happened, the first thing they did was to pray to God about it. And that itself is another important lesson for us now. Because we see by this that even though the situation was dire and that there is an urgency in all that is happening, because they know that once Passover is done, right, once the festival is finished, then Peter's finished. They know that this is happening with a clock that is quickly ticking down, because they know the outcome of this trial that he will face. Yet we see here that they sit together praying. They didn't launch a jailbreak. They didn't burn the town down. Instead, they prayed. They showed their trust in God to control the outcome according to his will, according to his plan. And as I said a moment ago, there is a lesson in that. If you trust the plan, then you can trust God. Whatever's going to happen, it can only happen according to God's will. So if you know that and believe that, even if you don't know how the plan all works, if you trust that there is a plan, and you can trust God to make sure everything happens according to that plan. Now, having said that, we see that their prayers are actually a little bit empty, okay? There is a bit of a trust issue with these people, because we do see in verse 12 that after the angel had led Peter out of the jail and set him free, that Peter went to the house where they're all praying at, and then it says that he knocked at the outer entrance, and a servant came to answer the door. But after she has seen him there, and then now told everyone that Peter's out of jail, he's right there at the door, that he's there at the house, right where they're praying, for God's intervention in all this, we then see others say to the woman who answered the door, "You're out of your mind." Right? They simply don't believe that Peter could have gotten free. And then it says that Peter kept knocking, and when they opened the door and saw him, that they were astonished. It's as if they couldn't believe they had actually had their prayers answered. We see them praying to God for him to do something. He does it, and then they refuse to believe that it's actually happened. In fact, they even say in verse 15, it must be his angel. Even when they're convinced that there is someone at the door that looks like Peter, they still can't believe Peter could actually be standing there. It's like the old story of everyone coming to church to pray in a drought-ravaged town. And then when they walk outside and find that it's raining, everyone realizes that they didn't bring their umbrellas because no one actually thought that it was going to rain. Right? They prayed exactly for that, but who honestly thought that it was going to happen? Well, it's the same kind of thing happening here. Their prayers got answered, and yet they refused to believe it. But what this means is that we should always be prepared for our prayers to be answered. Don't be shocked when it happens. These people prayed for God's intervention, and God did exactly that. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that we will always have our prayers answered the way that we want, right? God is not a genie who answers wishes. But if we believe that God has things under control and that he does intervene in the workings of this world, then yes, prayer will be answered even in the most miraculous of ways. But before we finish this passage, we see here that God intervening in the normal order of things, it's not finished yet. Because a large chunk of our passage here deals with another event that is going to happen not long after Peter is set free. And what we see here is that Herod is going to die. And he doesn't just die because his time was up, as in he was elderly or he was in poor health. Instead, Herod was killed by God. This was deliberate, and it was a judgment on him. There's no coincidence here of him just dying after he did something wrong. He didn't do something wrong and then he just happened to have an accident out of bad luck. Instead, we see here that he sinned and God then had him killed for that sin. We see after this whole crazy event with Peter, Herod has the guards executed for letting Peter escape. And then he travels to another part of his kingdom and ends up working out some sort of peace treaty with some of the people there. And then it says in verse 21 that the day this whole thing was going to be finalized, he's on his throne, in his robes, addressing the people in a very kingly way. And then the people say this: "This is the voice of God, not a man." And no sooner they sing his praises, we see in verse 23, immediately, because Herod did not give praise to God, an angel of the Lord struck him down and he was eaten by worms and died. We see here that he dies because of his ego. He takes the worship of the people, worship that should go to God alone, and he's struck down because of it. It's a divine judgment on him. And as I said, it's not a coincidence that he died at that moment. It's a clear intervention by God into the normal order of things because of this man's behavior. And even more than that, it's also justice. When you think of what this king had done and the things that he had planned to do, because he's really getting what he deserves here. Because we know that he had James killed, and then he wanted to kill Peter, and then he executed his own soldiers for his own abuse of power in wrongly arresting Peter for his own political goals. So this death really is justice done. He was an abusive ruler who killed innocent people. And that means that another important lesson is given here. Because it was God who struck him down. It's not Christians assassinating him. They didn't take things into their own hands. There was no revenge on him for his persecution, nor did they knock him off before he could kill other Christians. Again, just like not mounting a jailbreak to get Peter out. Again, they leave this stuff up to God. They didn't need to get justice because they know that God has a plan and his plan will protect his church. Christians may get blamed for doing wrong. After all, when Peter finally does die, when he does get killed, this time by the next emperor in Rome, Nero, emperor number 4 in the time frame of the book of Acts, Nero has Peter crucified, and he does this because he blames the Christians for burning Rome down. But they didn't do that, because that's not how the people of God's church operate. God's people operate and work within the law, and even when one of their own is wrongly arrested or even killed, they leave it up to God in his providence to deal with it. God will bring justice and will deal with all these things in his own time. Christians don't have to get involved in getting even or taking matters into their own hands because we don't live in a world of chance, but one that is controlled by a just and all-powerful God. And that's the main message for us today. To trust fully in God and to hand over everything, all our needs, all our troubles, hand them all over to him and know that he has a plan, and to trust in that plan and trust him to be able to fulfill it. As we see here, Peter was saved from his troubles. He didn't put up a fight. Instead, we see that he was peacefully sleeping when the angel came and had to poke him to wake him up. There was no urgency for him, despite the obvious problems heading his way, and the fact that he had just seen James killed only maybe just days beforehand. And as we see with the other Christians during this injustice and wild persecution by an evil king, we see that there was no rioting, there was no plotting a rescue or a revenge attack. Instead, they just prayed to God and handed it all over to him. There's a clear message in that. Know that God directs and controls all things, so trust him in all things. And know that even when the worst things happen, that these things happen for a reason. We see here that the Apostle James was killed. And we also know that whilst Peter was miraculously saved, he would also himself, like most of the apostles, be killed years later, and there was no angel sent to save him that time. Peter escaped death in this passage. But 20 years later, during the persecution by Emperor Nero, Peter would be executed. So bad things do happen. We cannot think that being a Christian means walking around with some kind of invisible force field that saves us from the problems that we might face. But we know from what Jesus said to both James and Peter years earlier, that even the most horrible things that they had to deal with, these too were a part of God's plan, and it served a greater purpose. So yeah, life can be hard. And we can probably all, at times, be left wondering when bad things happen. Is there a plan? What is God doing? Why would he allow this? But we don't always know the full picture. The example often given of a tapestry is still probably the best way to understand this. Because a tapestry, on the side that you look at, is a beautiful picture. But on the other side, on the back, it's just a jumble of knots and cut threads. You can't make anything out. It's just a mess of colours and strings just running back and forth. But that reverse side is very much like our world. We often can't figure out why there is a pandemic or a terrorist attack or just an unexpected accident. That we see one side of the plan, the backside where everything is all just a mess. We don't see how this all connects on the other side in order to make something beautiful. But even if we can't see how it all works, well, we can know for sure that God does have a reason for why he allows certain things or doesn't allow certain things to happen. There's always a purpose behind everything because he truly is in control of all things, and all these events are steering us towards a restored, perfect world that he is going to bring about. A world where there will be no pandemics or terrorist attacks or accidents, and the troubles and hardships of this world will come to an end. So to finish up, as we think about what it means for God to be in control of all things, and as we think about this idea of his providence and the plan he has for this world, ask yourself, what do you need to hand over to God? What things you need to let go of and trust him to deal with? And perhaps ask yourself, how much do you trust him with these things? Are you seeing life as random chance and not the work of an all-powerful God? Or do you know in your heart that he is there and he's listening to your prayers, like the Christians that prayed for Peter in this passage? And not only listening to those prayers, but able to act on them. There is a power to deal with these problems. And he's not a God who is distant, but he's constantly active in this world. Right? As Jesus said to his disciples, including James, who was killed here, Indeed, the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Right? God's not distant from us. He knows every one of us personally, and every one of us is a part of this plan for his creation.